Hey, Lucky 13. I originally said I wasn't going to do a lecture, but then there were some things I needed to talk about, so I changed my mind. Sorry. But I'll keep it short, I promise. So housekeeping. This week, the quiz is open. Take that by Saturday at 11:59. The theme of this week's stuff is Christianity and modernity. We're moving into some more modern issues now. We've talked a lot about history and stuff that happened hundreds of years ago. Now let's talk about some modern things. What I want you to do is read McGrath. There's a section of McGrath. The page number is in the syllabus. There's a Francis Collins lecture. The link is always also in the syllabus and also in the announcements, the newsletter that I sent. It's about an hour and change. Watch that. And then read, there's an article from The Guardian about Catherine Hayhoe, who's an evangelical climate scientist. Read that too. So it's two pieces of reading, one very short. The article's not very long. One, decent length. But then there's this one lecture. And I want you to watch it because Francis Collins is kind of an emblem, a symbol of the impulse to integrate modernity, particularly modern scientific discoveries, and Christian faith. He's an interesting figure for that. So anyway, I want to talk about the modern age. And actually, before that, I wanted to address a question that comes up on silence a lot. Many people, when they read silence, and I notice this in a lot of your responses, they get to the end and they go, I can't believe he apostatized. I can't believe he fought that hard and that long, and at the end he just gave it up. What I would say to that is be careful. Because on the one hand, yes, he did apostatize in the sense that he went through with the act of putting his foot on the fumi, and it said quite clearly that this was no mere ritual. It wasn't something that was just meaningless. It meant something. It was a willing denial of Christ. But at the same time, he was spurred on, and the question becomes, who spurred him on? Was it clearly the voice of Jesus, or was it kind of the weakness of his will? Was it a demonic spirit that spurred him on? It's hard to say. Endo doesn't give us any clear answers. Cards on the table, I do think it was Jesus that spurred him on to trample. I think that, and the reason why I do, is in a weird way, that act of rejection, that act of ultimate, it's an act of rejection, but it's also an act of giving up everything that he had built his life around. And for what purpose? For what? Why would Rodriguez give up everything he built his life around? All of his goals, all of his aspirations, all of his identity. Why would he give all that up? To love other people. So it is. And it's hard. It's complicated, because it is a denial, but it's almost a denial for the purposes that Jesus would honor. If that makes any sense at all. So he is stepping on the image, but he's doing it out of love for others. And I think the point that Endo wants to lead us toward, although he's not going to be explicit about it, what he wants to lead us towards is that this is a very Jesus move. This is actually following Jesus, even though on the surface it looks like rejecting him. It's kind of a paradox. It's complicated, but it's interesting because the opinions differ about this. Many people say, well, he followed. Many people lay out a line similar to what I just laid out, but others laid out a line that says, you know what? At the end, he finally, ultimately rejected his Savior. And how in the world could you do that for any earthly, temporal reality? No matter, suffering is horrible, and what they were going through was horrible, but still, that's too far. That is, you're endangering your spiritual realities, your spiritual future, and you're turning your back on your Savior. I think Endo, and again, I might be reading it incorrectly because it doesn't come down hard and fast and obvious, but I do think that Endo is saying, no, watch what he's doing. He is stepping on the horrible position he was put in, stepping on the image, but doing so out of love for others, out of a desire to serve others, out of a desire to protect others from suffering, to the best of his ability to do so. And then you have the ending, which I mentioned in the last chapter, which is really weird to read in some ways. But one thing, if you read that last chapter closely, what it does seem to reveal is that he's still living in country. He does have a Japanese name and a Japanese wife, but he's still connected to Kichijiro. And that there's still some Christian activity going on in country. It didn't completely die. If you put two and two together, it makes you wonder if our man Rodriguez, married with a Japanese name, after all this is over, is still serving his Savior, is still serving the Lord. Not in an institutional way, obviously, but maybe in a way that's a little bit deeper and a little bit more underground, more more closely connected to what the indigenous Christians were doing, the ones who he thought he had to come and correct at the beginning of the novel. I don't know, it's something to think about. Like I said, there's no easy answers one way or the other, but I noticed that a lot coming down on the discussion boards, and I said, I better go ahead and lay out where I stand. I think that it was a rejection, but it was a rejection in order to follow the way of Jesus, which seems like a paradox, and maybe it kind of is, but that's how I see it. So anyway, silence let us talk about the missionary impulse, and it let us talk about the way that Jesuits and other missionaries were going all around the world spreading the message of Christianity. The great irony, of course, is while they were doing this, Christianity began to weaken in the centers where the missionaries were sent from, mostly Western Europe, and I would argue America as well, but Western Europe in particular, was the center of missionary activity in terms of sending out. But while it was sending out, it was also, the core was weakening and was getting hollow and was going to soon collapse. Why? Well, we talked about the fact that Reformation leads to denominations, which leads to religious disagreement, which leads to religious wars, crazy religious wars, so much bloodshed spread, not just over like religion versus religion, but denomination versus denomination, because we talked about how Catholics and Anabaptists and Lutherans and all these other people. Europe eventually says, stop. We cannot keep going on like this. We need tolerance. So there's a shift. There's kind of a collective, okay, you know what? Killing each other in the name of denominational war hasn't worked very well. Let's leave this territory to the Catholics, this territory to the Protestants, this territory over here to whatever, and just kind of live in peace. Can we be tolerant of each other? Can we live in peace and not attempt to convert each other and turn to the sword when that doesn't work? So you start to see people like John Locke, A Letter Concerning Toleration, 1689, right around the time of the Glorious Revolution. John Locke, if you know anything about American history, you know that Jefferson was reading Locke, Franklin was reading Locke, Adams was reading Locke. I mean, immensely influential on the American Revolution. What Locke had to say is he had a couple points he needed to make. He said the state can't adjudicate competing religious claims. It's not equipped for that. So the state can't come and say, you're a Catholic, you're a Protestant, you're in, you're out, you're going to get killed, you're in. The state doesn't have the equipment to do that. The state doesn't have the equipment to play religious judge, or certainly not religious executioner. Even if it could, he goes on to say, the state could not compel adherence to a religious tradition. It doesn't work for nation states to compel a religious tradition, because if they try, the results are disaster. And Locke's absolutely right. So he is the forerunner. He's advocating for tolerance. Let people live within the state, and let them worship, in ways that are differing from each other and not having to fear for their lives. For us, that sounds like, well, duh. But that was a major move back in 1689. So this is in some ways the birth of religious tolerance, and this is where you see, tolerance in this situation is a good thing. Let's not continue killing each other. Yes, positive. But what it also builds is this public religion / private religion split, where the nation says, we are Catholics, we are Protestants. But whatever, what's more important is what's going on in here. Faith becomes individualized, it becomes privatized. Before too long, it becomes marginalized. Because you have your faith commitments and I have mine, and how dare you try to foist yours onto me? You stay over there, I stay over here, and we'll be great. Problem is that doesn't work. There needs to be a default, and if religion is excluded as the default, what moves in as the default? Civil religion, and in some cases outright secularism, and that's exactly what happens. This is the age of reason. This is the age of reason over revelation. So in addition to exhaustion over religious wars, the rise of the Enlightenment, reason is elevated, capital R, reason. So in some ways, it's not replacing religion with irreligion. It's replacing Christianity with a religion based on reason, or at least a hybrid model of some Christianity, but mostly reason as the gold standard, the Platonic ideal, the ultimate thing that we're searching for and ultimately worshiping. It becomes an age where revelation can be explained. If we're talking higher criticism of the Bible, if we're talking about the advent of science, explaining natural phenomena, what used to be, think about things as basic as like thunderstorms. things that used to be chalked up to, ooh, the gods are angry, we can explain the science. We can explain exactly how it works, and we can explain everything about it. We don't need to be scared of it anymore. This is the age where that really starts to happen. I have up here a link to that story. You might have seen this fable. It's called The Blind Man and the Elephant. It's about the blind man who approached an elephant, and one says, "What is this? I've never seen it before." Feels the ear and says, "Oh, it must be a fan." One feels the leg and says, "Oh no, it must be a trunk." And one feels the side of it and says, "Oh, it must be a house." I don't remember what it was. But the moral of the story, of course, is that they're all seeking God in their own way, and they're all finding a certain element of God, so they call that God and just leave it there. And this is it's a fable about, tolerance and religions and everything else. That they're all searching for the divine. They've all found one corner of the divine, and they've claimed it to be the whole thing. And isn't that mistaken? They should be tolerant of each other's religious expressions. It's a really arrogant fable, quite honestly, because it also presupposes it presupposes the role of a narrator who can see the whole elephant. And this is the role that reason wants to step into. It's not we're going to. It's not a case of going to a completely neutral state. There is still going to be an arbiter. There's still going to be a referee. There's still going to be a one whose standard is followed. In the period before, more rightly or wrongly, that was a religious standard. That was we follow the teachings of Christianity as it's related in Catholicism, as it related to Protestantism. That's our guide. That's our model. It wasn't a case of we've gotten rid of everything and now we're just tolerating each other. What happens is a new standard, a new model moves in. And this is the model based on reason, based on the explanatory power of reason, and also based on a certain human arrogance. We don't need to kowtow to religious revelations anymore because we are smart enough, we can explain them. So reason is omnicompetent. This is the era of the rational philosopher and the scientist. Reason explains revelation. And this is, no surprise, this is the era that gave birth to the American experiment. The American Revolution came out of this. The Church of England, and by extension, the English rulers were seen as this kind of the old model, what we're getting rid of in the name of our new experiment, our new belief in reason, and that's joined up with the idea of democracy. So you have democracy and religious freedom joined together. And this is where the birth of the separation of church and state comes from. It changed in terms of what most folks took it to mean, but in its original statement, this was looking at the way in which nation states and religions had been conflated in a really dangerous way, costing a lot of lives, and also diluting the essence of the religion. So it was like, as McGrath tells it, this is let the pure gospel church live. This was done, separation of church and state was done to protect the church, not necessarily the state from the church. It was protecting the church from this kind of diluted nation-state church thing happening. And the ultimate example was the Church of England and how the Church of England influenced English rule. Separation of church and state is born from, the line itself, obviously, it's a Jeffersonian line. The whole idea of a wall of separation between church and state. But actually, it goes back earlier than Jefferson. It goes back all the way to Roger Williams, who founded the state we call Rhode Island. He was the first one who said the wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world. So Williams, it's not saying we need to protect the purity of state politics from the church. It's exactly the opposite. We need to protect the church from the machinations of political madness, which results in death and results in oppression and results in all these things, and also dilutes the church, dilutes the message, dilutes the people who are a part of it. The wall of separation is we must protect the church from the state. And this is also the way that Jefferson takes it. And you don't hear that today. You hear it today expressed in terms of let's keep the church, and specifically morality associated with the church, as far out of the public square as possible. That's not what's going on. This is what it comes to mean, obviously. But in its original iteration, separation of church and state was, we want to build a space for you to go worship however you want, and we don't want to get involved in that or compromise that in any way. The wall was for the benefit of the church, not necessarily the state. Of course, as time goes on, it goes exactly flipped. where it becomes we need to protect the state and protect those who have nothing to do with the church from the machinations of Christians and other religious people and the moralities that they want to foist upon the public square. This is obviously a big player in the abortion debates. It's a big player in the same-sex marriage debates. A lot of these common issues that we're still arguing over, that we're still talking about, are rooted in this flip of the way that this idea, this doctrine, if you will, was taken. But this is the beginning of the modern age, though, because what you have with the separation is you have, like I mentioned, individualization, privatization. And in America and in Western Europe, these old guard hotbeds of Christianity start to think, well, maybe this isn't the right way. Maybe this faith that our ancestors gave us does more harm than good. So maybe we need to move on and move kind of into a post-Christian direction. Because if you think about it, that term's used a lot to describe America. It's certainly used a lot to describe Western Europe. But this idea of post-Christianity, this idea of we move beyond into something else. So, for the Christians, there's a couple of different things they can do. Ironically enough, I mean, a lot of irony today, the missionary impulse helps to save Christianity in a lot of ways, because the missionary impulse takes, when the religious tradition, when the Christian tradition in America and Western Europe begins to hollow out, instead of the whole thing collapsing, it just moves. The center of the Christian church on earth becomes not Western Europe and America, but it becomes South America, it becomes Asia, it becomes Africa. I mean, the African church is still exploding. The Asian church, Chinese house churches. Go Google Chinese house churches. Unbelievable. The vitality of the Christian faith in Latin America. I mean, it's funny because they do these surveys about the state of American religion. Mainline is really suffering. Evangelical is really suffering. Catholics haven't suffered as much. But what you come to find when you dig a little bit deeper into the data, white Catholicism has plummeted. But why is that? Why is the Catholic Church in America not feeling the same effects as the mainliners and the evangelicals? Well, obviously it's because of the Hispanic, the influx of immigration and Hispanic residents has bolstered the Catholic Church, has held it up. And that's why the numbers aren't as bleak and as depressing for adherents of the Catholic Church in America as they are for other religious traditions. This is a time of this is a downward time for Christianity in America. The rise of the nuns, the ones who claim no religious affiliation, their numbers are exploding. A lot of the mainline religious traditions like Methodism, Presbyterianism, Anglican / Episcopalianism, they're all declining. Evangelicals resisted that decline for a while, but now they're fully in that. They're in that decline as well. Southern Baptists, non-denominational evangelicals. The trend line is going down. But what you have is the trend line going up in other parts of the world, other parts that historically weren't as represented. That's why it was such a big deal when Francis was named Pope. I mean, typically, the Catholic Church, they were gonna have a Western European, quite frankly, or at least an Eastern European. They didn't have very Latin American, and a Jesuit at that. So when Francis got elected Pope, that's when that was kind of a bellwether for a lot of people. Like, wow, where the vitality of Christianity is? It's not Western Europe anymore. It's not America anymore. It's South America. It's Asia. It's Africa. That's what's going on. Personal story for you. I remember going to Haiti. I was teaching Bible to pastors in Haiti. Spent a week doing it. It was amazing. But we went to a local church service, and our little contingent got there, I'd say about 8:30. Felt pretty early to me. It was obvious that the service had been going on for a while. And it was, when I say the service, we went to the church. The church was basically cinder blocks with open air windows. It was the most rudimentary structure you could possibly imagine. But we got there, and it was obvious that the church service was going for quite a while. So we asked someone, "What time did it start?" They said, "Oh, it started at 6 a.m." Oh, and we were there at 8:30, and we were there for a good couple hours. It was a long service. But there was an energy and there was a vitality that oftentimes isn't seen in American congregations anymore. Certainly not as much. So the point is, when the modern era hits Western Europe and America hard, and you have challenges like the Industrial Revolution, and you have biblical criticism, you have the Darwinian Revolution and the Scientific Revolution. All these things hit Christianity hard, and there's something called a hermeneutic squint, which is just a fancy way to say everything Christian is looked at with suspicion. Hermeneutics is basically how you interpret, and a squint implies skepticism. It implies this idea of These things are like, take the Bible, for example. It was taken as an unquestioned word of God for many, many years. Well, we've learned a few things about how it was constructed and put together. Now we kind of squint skeptically at it. That's what the hermeneutic squint is. So all these challenges come. In a real way, the faith migrates elsewhere, but not completely. You still have people in Western Europe and America who are trying to reconcile. And that's the state of a lot of Christians today. And that brings me to the ones that I asked you to consider. Francis Collins, number one. Katharine Hayhoe, number two. Collins was a director of the Human Genome Project. Studied DNA, the world-renowned geneticist. Also a famous Christian. Founded an organization called BioLogos, which attempts to reconcile things like evolution with Genesis 1 and 2. Reconcile modern science and modern scientific discoveries with Christian faith. It's a fascinating organization. I recommend you check it out. BioLogos, BIOLOGOS.org. Katharine Hayhoe is climate scientist. Done a lot of good work on climate change, and specifically convincing evangelicals that climate change is something they need to take seriously. But both are Christians, and both are attempting to integrate reason and science with revelation and how that works in their lives, and that's why it's interesting. You really should go look up some of Katharine Hayhoe's talks online. I didn't ask you to look at one this time. You really should, because she's an interesting person. But both of them challenge the idea that reason assumes atheism. Because at its most extreme, the modern era kind of assumes that reason, if you are a reasonable, educated person, you are going to be atheist. I don't have to tell you that. You go to the University of Florida. But they both challenge this idea, and they say there are elements of reality which extend beyond science's reach. Science can explain a lot, and science can do a lot as long as it's kept in its proper channels, but there are elements of life, elements of wisdom, elements of things that can be known that extend beyond those channels. And if science tries to go into those channels, you have scientism, you don't have science. And scientism is dangerous. Scientism is scientific method and process as religious experience. And this is, and I would argue this is the Richard Dawkins story. This is the story of people who believe that science can explain everything. Whereas Collins and Hayhoe are going, science can explain a lot, and we are working scientists. We've seen that, we've experienced that, but there are elements of the human experience, elements of the human condition that science just can't touch. And there's a term, I really like this term. It was a term made up, well, not made up, but coined by Stephen Jay Gould, an evolutionary paleontologist, I think. Anyway, Stephen Jay Gould. He said, the realm of science and reason and the realm of religious revelation are non-overlapping magisteria. They are both sovereign in the realms that they control, but they don't do this. You ask one to do one, you ask the other to do the other, and you leave them and let them go. Now, that's controversial because there's a lot of people that question whether that can actually be done. But it's an interesting idea. And so Collins and Hayhoe are helpful for getting at how can faith and science, modernity and faith be reconciled. Fundamentalism says it can't. And it discounts science as a result. I grew up in church. I grew up in churches that, in the store of the church I grew up in, there was a bumper sticker that said, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. So that's that kind of sensibility, that kind of, well, you can come at me with whatever science you want. I'm going to say the science is flawed because I believe in the Word of God. Okay. A long history and a long tradition there. That tradition got whipped pretty soundly at the Scopes trial, which is a key moment in American history. And if you don't know that story, I would suggest you go back and find it. But coming off the heels of the Scopes trial, and again, evolution, and Darwin is ironically the poster boy for this. It is ironic because Darwin's ideas on religious faith were really, really complicated. Richard Dawkins and a lot of the belligerent atheists like to claim Darwin as one of their own. Darwin was a Christian turned agnostic, and what cost him his faith as much as anything else was not his scientific discoveries as much as it was the loss of his little girl. His little girl died when she was about 10, I think. And that spawned a religious crisis for Darwin, which eventually led into agnosticism. Anyway, the momentum is with secularization. Post-Christian starts to be a real thing. Churches try to answer this as best they can. Vatican II, the major Catholic conference in the early 60s, has a term called aggiornamento, which means we need to bring the religion in step with the times. We need to get caught up and get modern because we don't want to get left behind. We don't want to be in the ghetto weevil dialogue. But the modern era and the modern sensibility is ascendant, and it gives birth to atheist nations. and it gives birth to we will rely exclusively on human reason. And again, one more irony for you. The modern era, which begins as a response to religious bloodshed, sees more bloodshed than all the previous eras combined, as godless, quote unquote godless atheists, nation states such as Cambodia, Soviet Union, China, kill a lot more people than Martin Luther and the Catholics ever dreamed of. So it's another interesting irony. So anyway, Christianity and Marxism, they start to really become foes at this time. Marxism becomes a competing ideology of Christianity. I will leave you to read McGrath on more of that, but you do have interesting cases of where this comes up. But some of the responses to this modernization, I mean, some of the good responses, you have things like the Civil Rights Movement, you have Pope John Paul II, the fall of the Soviet Union. So you have things that show a Christian vitality even in Western Europe and America. But for the most part, the modern age is an age of where the Christian faith starts to pick up and move, starts to go to South America. You have things like liberation theology, which is really vibrant, and this is the tradition that Francis comes from. You have things like feminism, where it's groups that were underrepresented, that were marginalized, are starting to really come forward and start to do a lot of amazing things. And then you have globalization, which changes the game for everyone. But anyway, that was blitzing through it ridiculously fast. But the main key, the main takeaway, we talked about silence and the missionary impulse, wherein Western European missionaries go to the quote unquote backwaters of the world to spread the gospel. Well, the modern era is where that situation kind of flips, and the sending bases hollow out, and the vitality of Christianity is found in other places, the places that once these other nations were sending missionaries to, and they've become the flip, where more people are sending missionaries to Western Europe and America now than than vice versa. So anyway, yeah, way too fast. But anyway, that'll hopefully give you at least a little bit of a beginning in terms of dealing with McGrath on the modern age, dealing with Collins and Hayhoe. But again, if there's not something that doesn't make sense, or something where you need me just to stop and slow down and go a little bit more into detail, please don't hesitate to let me know. Otherwise, enjoy your week and enjoy the Thanksgiving holiday.